I'm convinced that political parties have been one of the worst things that has happened to our republic. The modern preacher has been force-fed the myth of separation of church and state all of their life. Because I believe that a God-called man is not going to censor the message, and he's not going to just preach the parts that people want to hear. He's going to preach what I would call the whole counsel of God. And there's some tough stuff.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited to be here with Dan Fisher. He is a pastor, author, former Oklahoma State legislator who's leading the charge to awaken today's church through a bold legacy of the Black Robed Regiment. He is the co-pastor of, Dan, I need you to tell me again, is Life Point Church, is that correct?
Life Point Bible Church, yes.
Life Point Bible Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. He is the author of Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment, a call for preachers who will fight. As those of you know, I am a big believer in Christians standing up and fighting for things that are going on, that we should engage in acts of civil disobedience when the government is trying to force us to do something that's against God's will. So I'm excited to talk to him about this. So Dan, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, Peter, it is a privilege. It's good to meet you, and it's great to be on your program.
So I'm familiar with the Black Robed Regiment, but again, that's not something that we talk about in history books, even in the history when history was talked about the United States positively. So tell me, who is the Black Robed Regiment, and why are they so pivotal to the American Revolution?
Well, they are the preachers of the War of Independence, but they didn't begin there. You can trace them all the way back to the separatists that we call pilgrims landing, in Plymouth today. It is a brand of preacher who did not separate their, what we call today, secular life from their spiritual life, so to speak. They believed that every aspect of life was spiritual. And so they believed that their political views were really forged out of biblical principles. So there was no this idea of separation of church and state wouldn't have entered their minds. So it's the preachers who had preached for decades about the need for Christians to be involved in governance. And if you go back and look at our history, pastors were some of the key leaders politically for decades and decades. Now that seems very rare to people today, but that was commonplace then. So as you lead up to the 1760s, 1770s, when it was pretty much obvious that the British were just going to keep strangling the colonies, you have these preachers preaching these fiery sermons about the need to stand up to tyranny and break away. And eventually that happens, as we all know, with the Declaration of Independence. Many of these preachers were influential in what we call our founding fathers, what I tend to call our framing fathers. And they were actively influencing. Many of those framers or founders attended these guys' churches. And then eventually, when the war breaks out, many of these preachers round up militias, and some of them served in the regular military, guys like Peter Muhlenberg and others, and they fought. They literally went out on the battlefields. Now, the preachers kind of served as chaplains.
Right.
So they cared about the spiritual needs of the soldiers. But when the fighting time came, many of these guys would pick up muskets, as we'll probably discuss, and they would fight. And so these guys believe that you put your money where your mouth is, and you stand up for what you believe in. So that's what they did. And the reason they were called the Black Robed Regiment, they were actually called officially the Black Regiment. We added the word robed so people would know what we're talking about. All these preachers wore black robes when they preached. That was just traditional. It didn't matter what denomination you were. They're going to put on a black robe when they preach on Sundays. And so the British and the Tories, the Americans that sided with the British, they wanted to target these guys. And the best way they could is to refer to their black robes. So that's why they called them the Black Regiment. And they forged a place in our history. Sadly, as you mentioned, that is practically unknown in our day, which is so sad. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is join a chorus of voices trying to bring this history back up to the forefront so people know what these guys were like and why we have a republic today.
So, but there were loyalist preachers too during that time. Those that were supported the Tories, supported the British. They would also wear black robes.
Yes.
Um, but so just like today, you have groups that view Christianity as in support of one political movement, and those that oppose a political movement or support it in a different way. What So during that time, I'm just curious because I don't know this answer on this at all. But how did the British determine which black robe we're going to go and target and which black robe we knew was on our side?
Well, it was very easy. These guys were incredibly outspoken. Not only were they outspoken, but they were prolific in their writings. So historians today that are honest will tell you that many phrases in the Declaration of Independence and the writings of people like John Adams and Jefferson, you name it, you can see phrases in their writings that are practically lifted out of the sermons of these guys in those days. These fellows, even if some of the framers slash founders didn't claim to be born again Christians, they were very God-fearing, respected the Bible kind of people, and they would attend church. And most of them attended these kinds of churches led by these kinds of guys. Whereas the Tory preachers were just as equally outspoken against what we'd call the Black Robed Regiment. So it was pretty easy. And then once the fighting got started, I mean, it was incredibly easy because some of these guys are out on the field fighting. So I think it's important too for us to remember that in this day and time, there were no political parties.
Right.
I'm convinced that political parties have been one of the worst things that has happened to our republic. In fact, guys like Jefferson and Adams and George Washington warned America against allowing parties to form because eventually people would be more concerned about their party and their party being in power than the principles of their party. Right. Look what we've got today. So what these guys stood for was all the things that most of us hold dear. They're outlined in the Declaration: private property, the right to free expression, all of these things that eventually get codified in the Declaration and then end up, in the Bill of Rights. So they weren't hawking a party. They were fighting for liberty and individual, freedom. It wasn't about, well, we've got this party and we want to promote this party. And I think that's helpful so we can put this whole struggle within that context.
So, but it does beg the question, though, because in a situation like this, particularly when we're talking about, where their basic principles were, because obviously the loyalist preachers thought that the Church of England was, and the king was the official leader appointed by God of the church. They would use verses from Romans 13, 1 Peter, 2. They're called to submit to governing authorities. They used a lot of that stuff. Is it possible? And I'm asking this from a theological question here. Is it possible that many of those loyalist preachers, that when we go to heaven, that they will be up there with us? They just happen to be on the wrong side of history. Or how do we balance that with the principle that standing up for God's truth, that we can also be on the wrong side and still end up in the right place?
Well, I completely agree. I believe that many of those Tories were right about issues like salvation and Christian discipleship, but they were wrong about the divine right of kings. Now, here's the thing: the ones who were for independence, the freedom, what I'll call the freedom fighters, they didn't hate the king. In fact, in my book, if you don't mind me doing just a cheap commercial on my book on the Black Robed Regiment, I spend quite a bit of time talking about how these Black Robe preachers didn't want to do what they ended up doing. They'll even talk about how they never intended to separate from their mother country, i.e. England. And we have to remember these men and women considered themselves English citizens. The famous Paul Revere, the British are coming, the British, he wouldn't have been saying the British are coming. He was British. He would have been saying the regulars are coming. It'd be like me if I see the army in the parade on Saturday. I say, well, there's the Americans. No, I would say, well, there's the army. So these men considered themselves
Never thought of that.
English citizens, and they didn't hate the king. They just simply believed, in fact, they declared it, the king had disqualified himself from the right to reign because he had violated the charters, the English Bill of Rights. And you got to remember, even the Declaration says, when a long train of usurpations and violations leads you to a point. This didn't happen over, and I know you know this, but just in its context, this didn't happen in a period of 2 or 3 months. This happened over a period of 20 or more years, where the King of England began to resent the colonies and wanted to put his thumb on them. And of course, then King George becomes so unreasonable. And in the Declaration is actually pretty short. The biggest part of the Declaration of Independence is all the grievances that they had with the king. I think there's 27 of them,
Right,
or 26, somewhere around there. And they're going through a litany of the things that they had done, trying to work out some kind of reasonable peace. So when you go back to the Tory preachers, I think we can separate one's belief on government from one's belief on the kingdom of God and the principles that bring salvation. In fact, another shameless plug, I've been asked that question so many times when I go and speak, that I've written another book. It's a much shorter book on Romans 13, because I believe the average preacher misunderstands and then misapplies Romans 13 and teaches that it teaches unlimited submission to authority, meaning
right.
it doesn't matter, what the authority does, you've got to knuckle under. Now, I got to give numerous examples. What about those who fought against Hitler in Germany, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Was he
Right.
wrong? Well, no, because he wasn't a proper authority figure. He had abused the principles that Romans 13 lays down for what I call proper government.
Right.
When you talk about civil disobedience, we're talking about men who had exhausted, they believed at least, every opportunity. They even one last time gave the olive branch petition, where they said, King, please, we don't want to separate. Please talk with us, help us here. And he not only ignored them, but he in your face kind of thing, and Parliament kept passing laws that were just incredibly abusive. Yeah, so I gave you a long answer to that. I apologize, but
Well, you're a pastor and a politician. I don't expect anything less.
it's awful to interview a moron like me.
Well, but I think your point is correct, and I get challenged a lot on the Romans 13, which is because they take that half a verse, and I always think it's interesting that the man who wrote Romans 13 engaged in civil disobedience,
Was
nonstop.
constantly crossways with the government. Yeah.
So and even in Second Peter, again, the same thing. Like they weren't killed for following the law and submitting to the authority blindlessly. But to take it to modern day, though, and you say you get asked the question a lot and you get challenged on a lot. I understand. Again, I'm the same. I've been in the same position. So the question for you then is this: is that what is it? What do you think is the deep underlying reason why pastors, and why you need to tell pastors, hey, you need to start standing up. You need to start speaking up. You need to be more like the Black Robed Regiment. What do you think is their number one fear that comes in there, the obstacle that is preventing them from moving forward?
Well, I think there's probably 2 or 3 parts to that, if I can deal with those as quickly as I can. One, the modern preacher, I think, has been given, I guess, or developed a CEO mentality, where he's really in charge of a company, and the job is to make sure the bottom line is healthy, giving's good, attendance is up, We're building new buildings, we're expanding, starting satellite churches, all this kind of stuff. So he's really more like a CEO rather than a teacher and a prophet and a preacher and a pastor. He's kind of an administrator. He's a president. Now, he might not call himself that, but he's kind of got that. So a lot of preachers won't touch controversial issues because they don't want to offend people. They don't want to lose seats, people in the seats, nickels in the offering, that kind of thing.
Right.
The other thing I would say is that they have a gross misunderstanding of authority and governance from the biblical perspective. So like we were mentioning Romans 13, they completely misunderstand that. And then the third thing, they have been force-fed the myth of separation of church and state all of their lives. The modern preacher has been hearing that his whole life. And, what was his name? Something James. I can't remember his first name. He's considered the father of modern psychology. There's nothing so absurd that if you repeat it often enough, people won't begin to believe it's true. And they've heard this all of their lives. And so they really do believe that it's wrong to mix political views and governance with scripture, even though the Bible is filled with that subject. And I even tell people, find me an Old Testament leader that wasn't engaged in governance. Yep. Find one. I don't know of any that I can think of. So, but they've been, so it's kind of those three things, Peter, in my opinion. And it's kind of a collage of all of that has been put in a blender. And to be honest with you, and I'm going to be really cruel here, and people don't like it when I say this, but I'm a preacher, so I'm condemning my whole, collective group. Most of them are cowards. They're just cowards.
Yeah, I agree.
They just won't stand up for what they know. I think in their hearts, they know it's right to stand up to this, but they give in for personal reasons.
I'm actually just written a book. It could be pre-ordered. There's my shameless plug right now on my website, but it's called Bold, Not Belligerent. And the first half of the book deals with the obstacles of it. And what I find is that, there is a comfort, there is a convenience, there is, and I kind of wonder with these preachers that don't want to stand up, they don't want to answer the emails. They don't want to have to be confronted. There's a fear based, and it seems like every piece of it's fear, maybe fear of losing the money, maybe fear of and there seems to be that level of it. But at some point in time, it seems like the church is going to have to deal with it sooner or later. I mean, the Antichrist is coming. It's going to attack the church. We're going to have to deal with these issues sooner or later. So what advice do you give pastors right now who faithfully preaches on salvation? I mean, they do a great job. They get all the right marks on sanctification and justification, and they can speak ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek if they want to. They can do all that great, but they won't address the problems that are really facing our country now, like abortion, gender issues, pornography, those type of stuff. What do you say to those preachers that have that level of education, knowledge, and ability, but don't want to speak about those other issues?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that I would do is I would ask them to check their call. Were they really called by God to pastor and be a preacher?
Yes.
Or are they just a defender of certain biblical truths? Because I believe that a God-called man is not going to censor the message, and he's not going to just preach the parts that people want to hear. He's going to preach what I would call the whole counsel of God. And there's some tough stuff in God's word, and people don't want to hear it. Unfortunately, it's kind of like medicine. Doesn't always taste good, but if you need it, you need it. And you can't really appreciate the good news until you hear the bad news. And then the bad news makes the good news really look great. And these guys are they're too soft. They have a great living, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So that'd be the first thing. Check your call. Make sure that you're really called. I suspect that a lot of guys that are pastors today are good guys, but they didn't receive a direct call from God to do it. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing that I would ask them to do is don't interpret scripture based upon popular opinion and your situation. Truth stands alone by itself, connected to its history. And then the third thing I would say is read history, not just Hebrew history. As much as I respect Hebrew history and believe that God chose the Jews to do what he did with them, read your own nation's history or your own cultural history. Most pastors are completely, Peter, you know this, they're completely ignorant of most of these things. They don't know a Tory from a canoe. They couldn't tell you the struggle that actually, I mean, they know about, what they call the Revolutionary War, but they don't know that there even was a Black Robed Regiment. When I've gone and spoken, I do a presentation where I'm in costume and I become an actor, and I become some of these men as I tell their history with multimedia. And I even have a little traveling museum with relics that are just phenomenal, actually. But I'll have pastors come up to me after that presentation. It's about an hour long, and they'll say, I never knew any of this. This is all new information. And Peter, probably like you, I painstakingly nail down the documentation so that I'm not just sharing anecdotes. I'm sharing things that are verified historically. And if something's really a little bit murky, I will either say that or I don't share it at all. But these guys don't know any of this stuff, and so they're horribly ignorant when it comes to the preachers that got them to where they are. And I would say to them, you value your own liberty and you're living it up. Somebody paid a very high price to get that, because as we all know, freedom isn't free. Somebody paid a price, and they need to find out who those people were and what was the price that they paid and why were they willing to take that stand and pay that price. And I think when they do that, their eyes will open, the scales will fall off, and they'll go, ooh, wait just a minute. I've been ignoring and neglecting a huge part of the truth, and I need to integrate that into who I am. And I have found that for most guys, when they do that, their preaching changes.
I'm a history buff. I love history. I was very, very fortunate to have some great history teachers growing up, like who they weren't the gym teachers that were forced to teach something.
Yeah.
That was my science class.
Yeah.
So I've been very fortunate in that area. But when I look at the Bible in and of itself, and I take it outside the context of anything, just and read it. You say, look at the Old Testament on it. I say, look at the heroes of the Bible and tell me who didn't stand up for what was right.
Exactly.
There's not one that I see at all, even when you're going through the Kings and Chronicles and you're going through that. You can't find them. I can't find one. And then I read the prophets and what they're saying, and I look around today. I don't need to look at our history. I can read Jeremiah, and it's not like Jeremiah is speaking to the U.S. right now.
That's exactly right.
So for me, when I look at these pastors, and I'm fortunate I have an outstanding pastor. He actually brought in Tim Barton with Wall Builders for this last Sunday.
Yeah.
But there's so many of them out there. That even if you take that out of context, or even if you just look at it straight from the Bible, I don't see how they can look at it any other way.
No.
How where it has to start from somewhere. And you're right, there's a calling. But even if I'm not called, if I just am basic, just basic study, I don't see how you can get around it.
Well, I preached yesterday about the effeminization of the church. On Father's Day, I talked about the masculinity crisis in the American church. The American church has become very effeminate, and that's no dig on women. God created women equal to men.
Right.
They play a vital role in God's kingdom, but they're not men. And at the same time, men are not women. And we complement one another, and God made us different, so that we need each other. Having said that, the American church has become so effeminate that the pastors are effeminate. So I used a number of examples. You're all familiar with every one of them. Take Abraham. He is the patriarch of the Hebrew people and ultimately Christians, because we are spiritual descendants of Abraham if we know Jesus as our Savior. Abraham discovers that Lot and his family have been caught up in a war between some kings and have been taken captive and are probably going to be made slaves or executed. Who knows what's going to happen to them? Abraham calls together the mighty men of his tribe, whatever you want to call it, community, and he goes to war to free Lot and his family, and he does a Robert E. Lee move. He splits his troops into two parts, which is normally devastating. You're going to lose, but it's a surprise attack. He wins. He brings Lot and his family back, spoils. That's when he meets this mysterious Melchizedek and gives him a tenth of everything that he's gotten in this war or this battle. Now, here's a guy that's the consummate spiritual leader out there on a battlefield fighting, or Joshua or Caleb. I mean, come on.
Right.
So you're right. The Bible stands by itself. That's why these black robe preachers didn't have any trouble knowing what to do. And if you read what they wrote, and of course, they all wrote their sermons. We record sermons today. They wrote them, and I think they were better than we are because it's now printed and you can read it. But
right.
they use all of these Old Testament examples and say, what could we do less, or could we do less than those people did? We're facing a similar threat in our day. And what are we going to do? Just stand here and do nothing and be forced to be a part of the Church of England? And you got to remember, the king wasn't just the king of the forests. He wasn't just the king of the army. He was the head of the Church of England, and you did what the king said, and you preached what the king said to preach. Now, he might not give you your sermon title, but you get out of line and you'll hear about it. They didn't want to be forced into that kind of mold. And they said, if we don't stand up, we're going to lose everything. So they did.
So looking at it again throughout the history, the loyalist churches faded after the Revolutionary War. They just they all just kind of went by the wayside.
Yeah.
Do you think that if our current church fails to act like the Black Robed Regiment, that we're in danger of becoming irrelevant like the loyalist churches did?
I certainly do, if we're not already there. Now,
that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, we're always relevant if we stand on the truth and speak it. So God says, my word's not going to go out and come back void. We get that. But in a national sense, I think we've already lost the republic. Now, that's my opinion. And I think that trying to hold together the blue states and the red states that hold diametrically opposed views on some of the core issues of life. These are not about These differences are not about how much funding should we give to the highway department,
right.
Should we build that lake. These are differences about when does life begin. Should you have the right to murder your baby up to 30 days after it's born if you decide you don't want it? Does an individual have the right to self-defense and can own firearms? Do you have the freedom to preach what you believe regardless of what others think about it? Those are the issues. And we're diametrically opposed. You can't reconcile those diametrically opposed views. So in my opinion, we're holding together a make-believe republic that probably died many decades ago. And I love America. I'm not dissing the flag. I'm not dissing the Constitution. I'm just simply saying, until we're willing to admit the obvious and then deal with it, we're eventually going to be pulled into some kind of horrific conflict. You're already seeing it. Look at what happens in cities like LA. Look at these fruitcakes that go and shoot these Minnesota representatives. People are members of government just because they don't agree with them. It's ridiculous. And look at the rhetoric. I mean, look at what happens. Look at how Tim Walz speaks at his rallies. I mean, first of all, he's a buffoon in my opinion, but it's obvious that the rift is there, but we ignore it because we're trying to hold together something that I think has already gone by the wayside. And I'm not talking about let's have a war and fight. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about let's admit the obvious and stop trying to live under the same form of governance that won't serve both groups. I mean, so every 4 years we have this massive struggle to see which side can get their guy in the White House, as if that's the way the republic was designed to work anyway, and it wasn't. Right. And so, the pendulum just goes left and right, left and right, left and right. And it's ridiculous what we're doing. So I don't know what that means, except to say, I think we've probably already lost it, and we need to admit that and create, as the Declaration of Independence says, a new form of government that protects our rights. That sounds terrible. I know it sounds militaristic and well,
It sounds very similar to a quote of Thomas Jefferson, where he says that basically we ought to redo things every now and then.
right.
So
I
so
think that would be the biggest surprise to the framers. I've had people say, "What do you think would surprise them the most?" Well, aside from the technological advances, which would
right.
blow their minds, you know what I think would surprise them? That we haven't had a revolution. I think they would be surprised that we're trying to live 250 years later under the same form of governance that they created 2.5 centuries earlier. Now, I'm not suggesting that they'd say, "Oh, well, republics are, out." No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is they would look at our present situation and say, "Good grief, you guys really think that you can live under a Republican form of government with these diametrically opposed groups? No, you need to get away from those people and let them do their thing and you do your thing." I think they would be amazed.
So if people want to learn more about Black Robed Regiment, where can they go? And your book on Romans 13, where can they go to find out about that, to find out more about you and what you're doing to help people, if other people are wanting you to come speak to their church,
Sure,
all of
sure.
that stuff? Where can they go for
Yeah.
all that?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is Dan Fisher, and then the three letters BRR, which stands for blackrobedregiment.com.
Okay.
Or they can go to my church website, which is the letters LB as in boy, COK.com. And of course, we archive every lesson I teach, every message. And of course, I deal with these things. I don't deal with them every Sunday, but I deal with all of these things, and we'll often bring some of the relics from our traveling museum that just blow people's minds. I want them to hold them, and see them up close and personal. So that's the best way. Dan Fisher, BRR.com or LBCOK.com.
All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much. I do appreciate you being on the show, and I look forward to. I plan on getting that Romans 13 book too, because it's again one of those that I love to look at and understand more.
Well, hey, text me your mailing address and I'll just send you one. You don't need to buy it. Don't go to the website. Just text me and I'll shoot one to you.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Man, thanks
it.
for having me.
All right. You have a blessed day.
You too. Bye-bye.